In 1908, Theodore Roosevelt was at the height of his power. He was a successful president in taming the corporations, in protecting the consumer. He had set aside millions of acres of land for conservation. The canal was under construction, well under construction. The nation had fulfilled all of Mahan's predictions and his recipe for national success. The United States was a force to be reckoned with around the world. Roosevelt had negotiated the end to two conflicts, the Russo-Japanese War and the Moroccan crisis in North Africa. Roosevelt had received, or was in the process of receiving, the Nobel Peace Prize. The United States battleship navy the Great White Fleet was traveling the globe. 1908, Roosevelt was at his zenith. But 1908 is also an election year. And Theodore Roosevelt had made a promise in 1904 as he won the presidency in his own right. He had said, I will not run for a consecutive term. I will not run for a third term. And so Theodore Roosevelt decides to hold to that campaign pledge, to hold to the fact he wouldn't run again. Now, no TR doesn't mean TR wants his policies to go by the wayside. In fact, quite the opposite. Theodore Roosevelt is going to handpick his successor. And he chooses William Howard Taft. Taft, who had served as a judge in Ohio, had been chosen to serve in the McKinley administration as a civilian governor for the Philippines, bringing the Philippine insurrection to an end. William Howard Taft had shown great diplomatic skills in dealing with the Filipinos and had developed a fondness and a love for the Filipinos that showed, and they reciprocated. And because of his success in the Philippines, William Howard Taft had been called to Cuba, had been asked to serve as a civilian governor in Cuba while it transitions to its independence. And then William Howard Taft had returned and served in Roosevelt's second term, his first elected term, but his second term, 1904 to 1908, had served as Secretary of War. Roosevelt liked Taft, and Taft liked Roosevelt. They were maybe not best friends, but they certainly were ideologically compatible. And so Roosevelt believed that Taft was the perfect choice. Taft was headstrong enough to get things accomplished, and yet he was malleable enough that Roosevelt could control him. The Democrats, for their side, are going to choose to retread, to bring forward William Jennings Bryan. Once again, running on the silver platform, once again running on the platform for inflation and monetization of silver and paper, and a departure from the gold standard. And so the candidates for 1908, Bryan versus Taft, are going to rally the party faithful, but it's really the popularity of TR, and that TR has chosen Taft, that is going to give Taft the edge. Now, Taft wasn't as vibrant a campaigner as Roosevelt. He certainly wasn't a lover of the fray. But Taft is an intellectual, a well-thought-out intellectual who understood the nature of the Constitution and the nature of government. And so where Roosevelt was boisterous, Taft is thoughtful. And as you can see in the various cartoons, Taft hugging the Republican elephant while the elephant pines for Theodore Roosevelt. Embracing the candidate they have, but while hoping for the candidate they want. And then King Roosevelt carrying Taft on his shoulder. And then in the upper right, Taft squeezed into the Rough Rider uniform that cartoonists so love to put Roosevelt in. Well, Taft was 400 pounds, squeezed into the little Roosevelt Rough Rider uniform as Uncle Sam looks on. And then my favorite is the bottom right. You see Theodore Roosevelt heading out of the White House, passing on his baby, his policies, to the nanny, the caretaker, William Howard Taft. Take care of my baby while I'm gone. But if you really look at this cartoon with an eye for detail, you see the Attorney General Altgeld carrying the big stick out of the White House, Roosevelt's big stick. But look at the baby's rattle. It's a baby little stick. It's a baby big stick. And Roosevelt's bicuspids, his pince-nez glasses are on the baby. And the idea is that Taft may be president, but he's president only insofar as he's carrying out Roosevelt's policies. TR held the Republican Party together by sheer force of his personality. But Taft, by contrast, Taft doesn't have that force of personality. He's not the dashing political figure that loves the fray, loves to get in and fight. Roosevelt, if there wasn't a fight going on, he would start one. He loved the fight. He loved politics. He loved the art of the maneuver. Taft prefers his books. He prefers in looking at what is right and what's wrong and sticking with what is right. He doesn't want to fight for power. He wants to move away from the imperial presidency. Taft will seek to avoid controversy, and thus he remains passive towards Congress. In Taft's writings, you see, and Taft writes, has voluminous writings that house his ideas both as president and later as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, which is his ultimate goal. That he saw Congress as the dominant branch of government. That the presidency, just like Washington and Adams and Jefferson and Madison and Monroe, saw the presidency as a safeguard to the interest of the people, but if what Congress does isn't in violation of that sacred trust to the people, then the presidency wasn't to be an obstacle. And so he doesn't like the fray. He doesn't want controversy. He wants to remain passive. Taft was a poor judge of public opinion. As a candidate, he often suffered from what many political candidates have, foot and mouth disease. He opens his mouth and inserts his foot. He makes mistakes. He makes gaffes. It was all irrelevant because the public loved him, and the public loved Theodore Roosevelt because Roosevelt endorsed Taft. And so the electoral vote for 1908 shows that Taft was exceedingly popular, 321 electoral votes to 162, an easy win over Bryan. Bryan goes down in defeat yet again. His popular vote count was well over 1 million votes more than William Jennings Bryan. And so Taft, now as president, takes the mantle of authority. Around the globe, he's going to implement a number of fundamental changes. And while his cabinet is his own, most of the cabinet is replaced from Roosevelt. And in fact, with Roosevelt leaving office, Roosevelt was a very good judge of Roosevelt's character. And Roosevelt knew that if Taft was going to have a chance to be his own man, Roosevelt would have to go away. And so Taft, while Taft takes the oath of office and enters the presidency, Roosevelt goes to Africa on safari. It was jokingly overheard. J.P. Morgan said that with Roosevelt in Africa on safari, now was the time for every good lion to come to the aid of his country. Morgan would have been entirely happy with Roosevelt becoming lion food. But with Taft in office, Morgan's problems aren't going to go away. In fact, almost from the beginning, Taft becomes entangled in his own policies, trying to walk a tightrope between Roosevelt's policies and Taft's policies, Taft becomes embroiled in controversy. And I love the cartoon on the bottom with Taft wrapped up in the yarn of the policies that he's tried to implement. And the first of those failed policies is with regard to trusts and regard to controlling corporations. And I'm going to try to juxtapose all of this with the square deal. Taft will bring 90 antitrust lawsuits during his 4 years in office. Contrast that with 40, maybe 44 for Roosevelt in his 7.5 years in office. Taft will have 90 lawsuits against monopolies in 4 years. Definitely the much stronger trust buster, but not using Roosevelt's standard for good and bad trusts. Now, he's not going to be as aggressive as later Woodrow Wilson, but Taft sees large, huge combinations as a restraint of trade. And one of the first corporations that he goes after was a corporation that Theodore Roosevelt helped create. Theodore Roosevelt, in one of those rare moments when he worked well with J.P. Morgan, J.P. Morgan had bought out Andrew Carnegie's steel interests, and J.P. Morgan had put together the largest corporation that had ever been in existence. That corporation was called U.S. Steel, and it brought all American steel industries under one corporation. It was the first American business chartered at $1 billion. Now, historians have argued whether some of that stock was watered, if it was inflated, but either way, it was one of Theodore Roosevelt's creations. Taft is going to pursue antitrust legislation, antitrust lawsuits against U.S. Steel, and will bring about its disillusionment. So with the dissolving of U.S. Steel, that first crack in the edifice, if you will, between TR and Taft occurs. A second idea or concept that Taft is going to split with TR comes over the issue of the tariff. TR had been a low tariff advocate, and he had fought for control of the tariff, seeing in it a political football that harmed the consumer. So if you take that second aspect of Roosevelt's square deal, the second aspect being consumer protection, one of the areas that he had fought to protect the consumer was in a reduced tariff. William Howard Taft is going to introduce legislation into Congress calling for them to reduce the tariff, and the resulting piece of legislation was the Payne-Aldrich tariff. And it not only didn't lower tariff rates, congressmen had taken the opportunity to jack up the tariff rates, so it was in fact a tariff increase, not a decrease. Taft isn't a scrapper. If this is the will of Congress, then Taft agrees to it. And so when Taft signs the Payne-Aldrich tariff into law, Theodore Roosevelt, who hears about it in Europe, is livid. A third area where Taft and Roosevelt are going to split is over the issue of conservation. One of Theodore Roosevelt's appointees was the chief of the U.S. Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot, which you see on the screen. Gifford Pinchot was a conservationist, and he had appeared many times at the White House with Theodore Roosevelt, had advocated the use of forest resources in a wise manner, had advocated the setting aside of acreage for national forest. And Roosevelt, to show his support for the forestry agencies, had made Gifford Pinchot head of the Forest Service. But William Howard Taft, while he was at heart a conservationist and was in favor of conservation, he wasn't as crazy about it as Theodore Roosevelt. And so in the Taft administration, he had appointed as a cabinet level secretary Richard Ballinger as Secretary of the Interior, which oversees a lot of the national domains. Ballinger transfers a section of public lands from the Division of Forestry to the Interior and then leases it to lumber companies for foresting. Over Pinchot's objection. Pinchot writes President Taft a letter and says, Richard Ballinger's doing something hinky here. He's moving around some lands, and I think there's something nefarious going on. You might want to investigate. Taft writes back to Pinchot, mind your own business. You are a division chief in the U.S. Forestry. The U.S. Forestry is part of the Department of Agriculture. He is a Secretary of the Interior. He's up here, you're down here, remember your place. Pinchot, not satisfied with Taft's response, goes public. And in a number of high-profile criticisms of Ballinger, Taft is forced to take action. And the action he takes is to fire Gifford Pinchot. It turns out that Taft was well aware of the land transfer. In fact, Taft had ordered the land transfer, and thus Ballinger was simply carrying out the president's bidding. But the firing of Gifford Pinchot sets off an open split between Roosevelt and Taft. So we've already seen Taft violate, in Roosevelt's perspective, violate the control of corporations, violate consumer protection, violate conservation. Now let's throw in another item, that fourth point of the square deal. William Howard Taft is going to support an idea called dollar diplomacy. His foreign relations center around using the dollar and U.S. entrance into other countries to open the door for business contracts. So rather than power projection of Roosevelt's big stick policy, Taft is going to advocate business and business dealings in foreign affairs. And it appeared that government and business were just a tad too cozy for Roosevelt's perspective. And so now we have in foreign affairs, and with regard to the canal, a lot of that dollar diplomacy dealt with Central and South American and Caribbean nations, all which protected the canal. And Roosevelt was afraid that it would ultimately put the canal in danger. The final split occurs, though, at the 1912 GOP convention. With the Republicans split, Taft representing the stalwarts, even though Taft really is a progressive, but Taft is forced to lean to the right, if you will, and represent the stalwarts, or the main body, the main guard of the Republican Party. But you have a very vocal opposition in the progressives. And the progressives focused around one candidate, Robert La Follette. Robert La Follette was the face of the progressive movement within the Republican Party, or as it was called, the Progressive Republican League. And so Senator La Follette traveled the nation, and it appeared that La Follette would challenge Taft for the Republican nomination. While traveling the nation, though, I believe it was in Houston, La Follette became ill and was unable to continue on. So while he convalesced, while he recovered, he asked Theodore Roosevelt to finish out his speaking engagements. And so Roosevelt began traveling the nation and declaring his opposition to Taft's policies. And of course, once Roosevelt had gained the national stage again, he wasn't going to give it up. And so poor La Follette is pushed aside, and Theodore Roosevelt becomes the face of the Progressive Republican League. That final split occurs in the 1912 GOP convention. The sitting president controls the convention, and so Taft is able to eliminate enough progressive delegates, i.e., TR supporters or La Follette supporters that would vote for TR, so that TR couldn't present a challenge to Taft. The way these conventions go, in the first round of balloting, delegates are pledged to various candidates. Now, once they have cast their vote in that first round of balloting, if no clear winner emerges, then they are free to horse trade. And so Taft wants to seal the nomination as quickly as possible. So by disenfranchising and disallowing a lot of La Follette and Roosevelt's support, Taft seizes the nomination without challenge. Roosevelt holds a rival convention and receives the nomination of a third party, the Progressive Party. The Progressive Party. So in 1912, with the Taft-TR rupture, there's going to be a three-way race for presidency. The Democrats have to find a valid candidate. Of course, William Jennings Bryan wants the nomination again, and the Democrats say, nay. No, we've lost too many times with you. Let's find a good progressive, a progressive that can equal the Republican progressives. And they really only have one. He's the progressive governor of New Jersey, Thomas Woodrow Wilson. The son of a Presbyterian pastor. He had been the president of Princeton University. He has a PhD in government and political science. Had written a book on congressional government. And he's going to become the face of the Democratic progressives. So you have Democratic progressives with Wilson. You have Republican old guard stalwarts and mild progressives with Taft, and you have the radical progressives of the Republicans with Roosevelt. And it's going to be which candidate can get their ideas out there before the public and influence and sway public opinion. Here's kind of a cross-section of pins from the day. Here at UT Tyler in the UT Tyler archives, we have a massive collection of political memorabilia that's been donated to the university, and a lot of these pins are from that collection. And so you see Wilson pins, Taft pins. Notice the Taft pin because he's the safest, and then the TAFT highlighted. He's not a radical. He's not crazy like Roosevelt and Wilson. He's the safe bet. You see the progressive pin, and then you also see there's another third party running, and I guess you could really call that a fourth party. It didn't get any electoral votes, that's why I didn't put it on the other screen, but the Prohibition Party running in 1912. They don't stand a chance, mind you, but the big three are the Republicans, the Progressives, and the Democrats. This is a campaign of ideas. The 1912 campaign is a campaign of ideas. When Roosevelt announces his candidacy, he announces it at Osawatomie, Kansas, and he distills his campaign ideas into a simple platform called the New Nationalism. The New Nationalism, which was based upon a book by Herbert Croly called The Promise of American Life. The Promise of American Life by Herbert Croly. In it, and in his platform, Theodore Roosevelt is going to call for a more active role of government in economics and social affairs. He's going to call for continued consolidation of the trusts and labor unions, but done with strict regulation of the government. You can still grow big, but it has to be under government supervision. He called for woman suffrage, giving women the right to vote. He called for minimum wage laws and social insurance like workman's compensation, a social safety net, if you will, that if you are unemployed, you can draw from a welfare fund until you can find a job. So, unemployed relief. These are new ideas of their kind, but you can see how he takes his square deal and he's expanded it. To answer Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson proposes the New Freedom. So you have the New Nationalism versus the New Freedom. He claims, at least on the surface, to not be a big state advocate, government having more control. He wants to reduce the amount of government control because you don't need government rules on business because business has been fractured into smaller companies. So Woodrow Wilson's New Freedom favors small enterprise, small entrepreneurs, and as he would say, the free functioning of an unregulated and unmonopolized market. He would shun the idea of social welfare. He rejects the idea of woman suffrage. As I told you prior, in 1912, he says there's more value in teaching a dog to talk than giving women the right to vote. He's going to change that in 4 years. He's going to pin the New Freedom on competition. Competition that comes about because of the fragmentation of big business. That business, by nature of being big, is bad. And so through vigorous enforcement of antitrust laws, he wants to bring corporations down. He gets a lot of his ideas on a book by Louis Brandeis, Other People's Money and How the Bankers Use It. Now, the book is actually published after the campaign, but his ideas were out there as papers, and he's a close intimate of Wilson, and so Wilson's drawing from the ideas that Brandeis later publishes. And so the New Freedom as opposed to the New Nationalism. Taft, he actually publishes a book after the campaign on constitutional government, I believe. I can't remember the exact title, but it's on legislative government. And he will in essence spell out the ideas he had in the campaign, which if you like what I've been doing, I'll keep doing that. But it's a call for the legislature dominating the political landscape. During the campaign, Theodore Roosevelt travels to Milwaukee, Wisconsin to deliver a speech. And as his motorcade arrived at the location, he got out of the vehicle to enter, it was in an alley to enter the side door. John Schrank walked up with the pistol you see at the bottom, and at point blank range fired into Roosevelt. an attempted assassination on the progressive candidate. Fortunately for Roosevelt, he had, and you can see in the corner, he had his speech folded up and his glasses case in his pocket. Excuse me. So with the bullet passing through, and you can see the speech and the glasses case at the bottom of the glasses case where the bullet went through that, it was able to absorb enough of the impact. In fact, let me tell you about that speech. That speech, Roosevelt typed out his speech in its entirety, and it was 50 pages long. All right, and then that 50 pages was triple folded, so it's folded over and over. So the bullet actually passes through 150 sheets of paper. So in essence, it passes through a small novel and through the glasses case before going into Roosevelt's body. It was able to defray enough of the momentum of the bullet that it slowed it down and didn't puncture anything major, but Roosevelt was bleeding. Now, imagine in your mind any modern politician that would do this. Roosevelt wraps his finger in a handkerchief and plugs the wound, goes up on stage and tells the public, he said, you know, I've been shot, but what I have to say is too important for me to just leave it unsaid. So Roosevelt speaks, and his speech is 50 pages long, so he's up there and he unfolds it, and he realizes as he unfolds his speech just how bad he is wounded. But he keeps his finger in the hole, and he proceeds to give his speech. And now when Roosevelt spoke, he would take each page of the speech as he finished, and he would chunk it. So, 50 pages accumulated on the front of the stage. Well, at some point, about page 40, he's getting a little woozy, and he's starting to rock back and forth, and all of his handlers think he's going to pass out. So the stage has an orchestra pit in front of it, and all of his handlers get down there in the orchestra pit to catch him if he should fall. And Roosevelt finally tells him, he's like, I'm feeling bad. I don't think you realize how badly I've been shot, but I'm going to go to the hospital now. And Roosevelt almost dies from a lack of blood. When he recovers and leaves the hospital, they ask him, Mr. President, how do you feel? Because, he's a former president, so they call him Mr. President. And he replied, I'm as fit as a bull moose. And so the bull moose stuck as a campaign logo and slogan for the Progressive Party. And so it's, in fact, most people today identify it as the Bull Moose Party rather than the Progressive Party. But it became the icon, if you will, of progressivism and the progressive movement. On Election Day, because of the Taft-TR split, Woodrow Wilson makes a virtual sweep of the Electoral College. Now, if you take the popular vote and break it down, Woodrow Wilson was a minority president. He did not get 50% of the popular vote. He got 6 million votes and change. TR got 4 million and change, and Taft got 3 million and change. So if you put Taft and Roosevelt together, they got 7,600,000 votes to Wilson's 6,200,000 votes. And if you put those combinations together so that Taft and Roosevelt's votes are counted together, whoever would have gotten the nomination would have won an overwhelming victory. But because they divide each other's vote, Wilson becomes president. We elect our president based on the Electoral College. Electoral College is based upon each state's majority vote. And so Wilson's able to get a majority because of the Taft-TR split. And so President Wilson takes office as the first Democrat to hold the office since Grover Cleveland. So since Cleveland left in 1897, here it is 1913, and Woodrow Wilson is now president. He had pledged the nation to a new course, if you will, and he called that new course an assault on the triple wall of privilege. So his progressivism is going to be an assault on the triple wall of privilege. So the first thing he does as president is use the power of the presidency to call Congress into special session, that his legislative agenda was too important to wait for Congress to come back to session. And he asked them to address the three areas that he felt were the most important in American life. First was what he called the first wall of privilege, the tariff. And so in attacking the Payne-Aldrich tariff as a violation of progressive ideals, he will introduce a new tariff bill. And when the senators and representatives did to this tariff bill what they had done to the Payne-Aldrich tariff bill for Taft, began piling on ever greater tariffs, Woodrow Wilson does something different. In fact, from the moment he took office, he did something different. From Thomas Jefferson to Woodrow Wilson, no president appeared before Congress to give their annual message to Congress, their State of the Union address. Woodrow Wilson will be the first president since Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson had a high, squeaky voice, didn't like public speaking, so he used the power of the presidency to say, I don't have to, and he'd send a clerk to read his State of the Union addresses. And every president afterwards thought that was a great idea and did it as well. Woodrow Wilson goes to the public, goes to Congress, presents his State of the Union address, and it was said that Theodore Roosevelt said something to the effect of, damn, why didn't I think of that? But Woodrow Wilson goes to Congress directly, and when they don't respond and they do the opposite, they begin jacking up the tariff, he does something that no president was able to do before him. He goes to the American people. And because of the direct election of senators, he's able to tell the people, you are now responsible for your senators, not your legislature, you. If they want to be re-elected, they have to respond to you. So it is you who must pressure your senators to lower the tariff, because that puts more money in your pocket. He's also able to employ a new invention. Now, Roosevelt used this invention, but nowhere near to the extent that Wilson will use it, and that is the radio. He's able to reach into almost every American home because of the widespread use of the radio and appeal directly to the American public and tell them to motivate their senators. And the result was the Underwood-Simmons tariff of 1913. A rolling back of the tariff rates. And in so doing, he succeeds in taking down that first wall of privilege. The second wall of privilege was the trusts. The trusts. Early in 1914, Wilson again asked to appear before Congress. Presidents can't just go before Congress, they have to be invited. So Wilson arranges an invitation to appear and address a joint session of Congress. And he calls for new legislation to tame the trusts. And Congress responds with the Federal Trade Commission Act. The Federal Trade Commission Act, which empowered the president to appoint a presidential commission to investigate interstate commerce, such as the meat packers, and to investigate their business practices and, if necessary, determine whether they are in violation of unlawful competition, false advertising, mislabeling, adulteration, or bribery. Then he follows the Federal Trade Commission Act with the Clayton Antitrust Act. It lengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act, the previous piece of legislation that Roosevelt had used. It lengthened the number of unaccepted business practices, and it included price discrimination and interlocking directories on the forbidden list. Interlocking directories, meaning board of directors of this company, and while company B over here can claim to be independent, its board of directors looks just like this board of directors, and the two board of directors are duplicate. So even though they call themselves different companies, in reality, they are the same company. And the board of directors on company B stifles the competition that would be on company A, and on company A being the monopoly. So interlocking directories placed on the Clayton Antitrust Act. And then because the Clayton Antitrust Act says all of the terms and things that it says business can't do, it specifically says none of the parts of this law can be used against labor. Because a lot of times what lawyers for the monopolies would do is say, in fact, labor was violating, they were a combination and restraint of trade. When they go out on strike, they restrain trade. And so a lot of the legislation was a double-edged sword. It affected business, but it also affected labor. Clayton Antitrust says it cannot be used against labor. And Samuel Gompers, who is a labor leader, declared that the Clayton Antitrust Act was the Magna Carta of labor, giving labor its freedom from the constraints of business. So with the Clayton Antitrust Act, Wilson has been successful against his second wall of privilege, and he moves against the third wall of privilege, the bankers. The U.S. banking system the United States was still operating under the Civil War National Banking Act of 1862. And so its banking system was woefully antiquated. And so using Brandeis's, other people's money, and how the bankers use it, Wilson is going to investigate banking practices, and once again, going before Congress, he proposes a decentralized federal bank. Now, the Democrats from antiquity have opposed a Bank of the United States. They've opposed the idea that the federal government should be in the banking business. But what Wilson proposes is a national bank, but a national bank that is decentralized. A national bank with 15 branches known as the Federal Reserve. So in 1913, he signs the Federal Reserve Act that's directed by a Federal Reserve Board appointed by the President. But instead of 15 banks, it was 12 regional districts, each with its own central bank. And although owned by member financial institutions, the final authority for the Federal Reserve Board remained in public control. The board was empowered to issue paper money called Federal Reserve notes. And if you pull $1 or $5 or $10 or $20 out of your wallet and look at it, you'll see at the top that all of our money today is issued by the Federal Reserve Bank. And so Federal Reserve notes backed by paper. And so the United States inflates its currency with the use of paper. William Jennings Bryan's great goal accomplished. The purpose being, paper can be easily inflated or deflated as the government needs it. If it needs more money in circulation, needs to put more economic engine online, it prints more money. And thus it lowers the interest rate to put more money in circulation. If they need to pull money out, they raise interest rates and slow down the rate of borrowing. And thus, government has a gas pedal or a brake for the economy. And that's, in Wilsonian view, that's why they would never have another stock market crash or currency crisis, because the Federal Reserve there was to protect us. You know that's not true, because in 1929 will come the Great Depression, in large part because of the paper currency and the failure of the Federal Reserve to regulate the market. Wilsonian progressivism extended into all aspects of American life, from the Federal Farm Loan Act to the Warehouse Act. The Federal Farm Loan Act made credit available to farmers at low interest rates. The Warehouse Act allowed farmers to deposit their crops in federal warehouses and receive a paper receipt for those crops. The government then took custody of the crop, but the farmer could put that crop on the market at their discretion. So it kind of gets away from the ebb and flow of the farming cycle. Highway Construction Acts, one of Wilson's big acts was the La Follette-Siemens Act of 1915, which required adequate working conditions on U.S. flagged vessels. One of the laws of unintended consequences, the federal government says you have to have these safety standards, you have to pay overtime, you have to do all these things on American flagged vessels. Well, companies quit registering vessels under the American flag. They would go to Panama or Liberia or some other country. So when World War I breaks out, the United States doesn't have enough merchant fleet to carry the American Expeditionary Force to Europe. We have to borrow vessels from Great Britain or hire private contractors to carry the American Army. A number of pieces of legislation were enacted to deal with child labor, the 8-hour working day, and a host of other laundry lists of progressive ideas. Woodrow Wilson accomplishes what progressives had been trying for 20 years to get in place. Woodrow Wilson accomplishes. And then as the next election approaches, he's going to change his mind regarding woman suffrage. And so as we turn away from Wilson toward his foreign policy and the lead up to World War I, 1916 is an election year, and we'll deal with it next time. But Woodrow Wilson is going to run as a progressive that has been highly successful. And we'll pick up there next time.